The most interesting landscape I've worked on, without a doubt, has been the Huon Peninsula terraces in the northeast coast of Papua New Guinea. These are coral terraces, and they rise in a majestic flight of stairs about 1,000 metres from sea level and run along the coast for about 80 kilometres. And they represent the effect of past sea level changes superimposed on a rapidly rising terrain or land. And this has been really terrific throughout my working life, trying to separate the effects of sea level changes in the past, which were related to the ice ages, the huge comings and goings of the ice caps on the northern continents and Antarctica, which have fluctuated at every 20,000 years or so enormously, with sea level changes of 120, 130 metres. Just imagine that, if that were to happen today. And this has resulted in the development of these coral terraces, which are like a huge staircase. And I'll come back to that later, but that's really been a fabulous part of my working life. But as I think about it, every time I wrote something, an interpretation of some particular part of this record, which is landscape and geology, only a few years later I find myself changing it. And why was that? Well, it's just because I guess one's work is never so complete or thorough or even very bright as to get everything right the first time. Well, so it's been with me anyway. And so another lesson from this is that there's, I guess it's just that nothing that one thinks at any one time is going to be the final analysis of what you're thinking about. And I guess that makes one cautious about statements that other people make with great certainty about this or that or the other thing. Now, how did I become a geomorphologist, if I am a geomorphologist? What I've just been describing has certainly been a large part geological analysis of stratigraphy, that is, deposits that are laid down, in this case coral reefs built one upon another, as much as it has been of the landscape. Well, I stumbled into geomorphology because I was offered a job when I was halfway through my PhD. I was offered a job lecturing geomorphology, and when I was asked was I a geomorphologist, I rather flamboyantly, I suppose, claimed I was. Well, I'd attended some lectures in the subject in the course of my studies as a undergrad in geology, and I liked it. But the particular appeal of geomorphology came to me when I was studying in geology, and I was reading a paper about nested valley formations in Wales, and it occurred to me that each valley which is contained in a larger valley above it, and itself contains a smaller valley below it, could perhaps represent the effect of erosion in a way that you could work out quantitatively if you measured the volume excavated in one valley and then the next one and the next one, knowing that they are successively smaller as they become lower and towards sea level, you could probably relate the volume removed to time that has elapsed. And that appealed to me because geology was a strange subject for me. It had a steady diet of physics and chemistry and maths. And here I was in a subject which, learning about a field which had certainly very little maths at the time, and yet there was this enormously interesting aspect of geology that was and geomorphology. It was a field science. It took you outside, and I had begun to wonder whether the sort of approach that we're learning about in, say, physics could be applied to evolution of landscapes. In this paper by O.T. Jones about the nested valleys in the Upper Toi drainage system in Wales, I began to wonder whether this might be something that one could apply more physical methods to the evolution of a landscape. Well, I mucked around with that, not at all successfully, but mucked around with it in various ways for a number of years. Didn't learn anything much about didn't learn anything much except that you could get the same result in a number of different ways. And if you like, I'll return to that, because that's something you encounter in science. You think you've got something right, then you approach it from a different direction, and you get perhaps the same answer using a different set of assumptions or methods. And that tells you that there's something wrong with the way you're thinking, rather than that any one particular way of thinking is right. Because if you get the same answer going at it from different directions, then it's either a fluke or there's something wrong with the way you're thinking. So that was interesting. But that was where I came into geomorphology. Now, there were a few other debts, if you like. One was, ever since I was a child, I liked looking at paintings. And I came upon the paintings of Paul Cézanne. And his perhaps most repeated landscape subject was the Mont Saint-Victoire in southern France, which he painted at least 25 times. And there's something about those paintings which had differed from most landscape paintings. They are not at all romantic or romanticized, and they had an extraordinary clarity of appreciation of the landscape. Now, I subsequently learned by reading Cézanne that one of his principles was that in order to know a landscape sufficiently to paint it, which essentially is always going to be a subjective activity, but you have to know it so thoroughly, he said, that you know its bones. You have to know the geology, you have to know the structure, you have to have some appreciation of the ancient history. And that remark well, that's utterly consistent with the field of geology and geomorphology. So that's a particular debt that I have. A number of others like that. Another one, of course, is how did I come across those coral terraces on the north coast of New Guinea? Well, I'd already been to Papua New Guinea and read an account by a Russian who was the first European resident on the north coast of New Guinea, that's Macluka Maclay, of a view of the terraces that he had as he was passenger on a Russian corvette, the Vitius. And his description, although brief, stuck in my mind. And then I was reading a paper by Rhodes Fairbridge which showed a remarkable photograph of these same terraces. And as I had already been to New Guinea, to the highlands, to completely different matter, looking for stone axe factories for the anthropology department of Auckland, as it happens, it struck a chord. And Fairbridge's article, which was about sea level changes, had what turned out to be a thoroughly imaginative but uncannily apt caption to the photograph of this great coral staircase. It said, "Coral terraces on the northeast coast of New Guinea contain fossil corals and pollens which represent or testify to past changes of sea level and climate." Well, of course, there are no pollen at all. And Fairbridge actually had never set foot on the ground either. He'd seen the photograph in a collection of wartime intelligence documents. When I met him some years later, I said to Fairbridge, I thanked him for his article, which had inspired me, and remarked to him that I thought it was surmised that he'd never been there. And himself said, no, well, I saw it from the observer's platform of a bomber during the Second World War. I had to use the photograph because I knew somebody, he said fulsomely, I knew somebody had come along and pick it up. Well, whatever one makes of the story, it was put me onto something. And the terraces themselves and the rivers that cut through them were a geomorphologist's Disneyland, so it turned out, not just for sea level, but for the interesting matter of landscape evolution, which is where I came into the subject, I think. Now, while I've, over nearly 40 years, returned to that Huon Peninsula field area, of course, once I started teaching geomorphology, I needed a little more exposure to the subject and different field areas in order to learn about it. So my first field work in Australia, a month before I began lecturing, was in January, February 1967 in the Simpson Desert, which was a pretty stupid decision on my part to go to the desert in central Australia at that time of year. However, it was enormously interesting and terribly bloody hot. Punishingly hot, but it was a completely different landscape, of course, from those that I was familiar with. And it was the beginning of a low-key but very long-lasting series of passages of work in the Australian outback and the north, in landscapes which are so different from those of New Guinea and New Zealand, where I grew up, which because of the plate boundary situation, enormous tectonic activity, they're vertical, and the Australian landscapes not only are old and red, but they're pretty flat. And yet in that flatness there's so much that is terribly interesting. the way that the bones of ancient mountain ranges, for example, remain as like the skeletons of giant beached whales that have begun to disintegrate. As you go north out of the Flinders Ranges, you pass through for example, through lower and lower ridges until you're driving across just the last pieces of the carcasses of ranges which were great mountains about 500 million years ago, if you can imagine that sort of passage of time. And I've always found it terribly rewarding to work around Australia. The last field work I did in Australia was, I think, about 12 years ago in, or 11, Hamersley Ranges, and in the Pilbara, in those ancient banded iron deposits. And once again, riveting landscape, terribly old, and with its own character. Now, this is something about geomorphology. Every place you work has its own character. It's quite a different science from the sciences like particle physics, where you're trying, I think, to find a basic set of particles, factors, from which everything else is composed, and using very, very high-grade, elaborate experiments to always work towards a single, if possible, conclusion or end. Geomorphology is a study, it's almost ideographic in the sense that every place is a little different. And there are no, in a sense, it's a mature science because there's no great theories, I think, waiting yet to be enunciated. It's an application of sensible observations and sensibly systematic observations, coupled with sensible assessment of everyday processes, which might be quite complex. Erosion of anything is a complex process, but sensible approximations to say something about how the land that you're looking at has formed. And not only that, but what it may do in the future, what may happen in the future if it's mistreated or modified by human activity. So it brings me to a question, firstly, personal question. If I wasn't a geomorphologist, what would I be? Well, earlier I remarked that from high school and first years at university, I had a steady diet of maths and physics and chemistry. And I was looking around for another subject to do and decided to do geology. Well, this was a revelation in a sense. Not in the laboratory, although I would come back to that, but going into the field and seeing things of which I had had no inkling whatsoever, despite my love of landscapes and being out in the field. I had no inkling previously of what things really were. For example, we were on an undergraduate field trip, and the lecturer's pointing out a fault, a geologic fault, where one part of the series of rocks pushed up adjacent to a series of rocks of much different age and separated by a sort of planar fracture, deep fracture or disruption. And he's pointing this out as a geomorphologic feature. I couldn't see whether we were supposed to be looking at something in front of our face or something in the great distance. And it was a revelation that I couldn't see, had no appreciation of the scale of what we were supposed to be looking at. Something similar came to me when attending the first lecture in paleontology, in geology, of course. The elderly lecturer, although not as elderly as I feel at the moment, still seemed to be a terribly old fossil himself, and he began his lecture by saying, "Fossils are preserved in one of four forms: moulds, casts, preservation of the original article, or complete replacement with a secondary mineral. Phylum, protozoa." And then he started talking in a gibberish which I had never encountered before about the anatomy of fossil creatures. And as he described them, I had no idea whether he was talking about things the size of dinosaurs or things the size of ants. And there was not a diagram drawn on the blackboard, only a lot of gibberish names, such as Textularia, order Foraminifera, or whatever it might have been. That first evening in the laboratory, we were supposed to be looking at fossils of these things that had been described that day without any diagrams or sense of scale. And we were given microscopes and tiny little things the size of grains of salt to put under the microscope. And these turned out to be what had been described that day. They were Foraminifera, the shells, if you like, of single-celled invertebrates. And this I knew from nothing. And that sense of scale which you meet if you think about, in physics, if you like, if you think about the range of scales from stars down to primary particles of the atomic nucleus, is there in front of my eyes. It wasn't a theoretical thing. It was there displayed in the very beginning of the subject of geology.